Well, I'm here with Carl Bildt. Mr. Bildt has a storied career in international politics. He was the Prime Minister of Sweden from 1991 to 1994. More recently, he was the Foreign Minister from 2006 to 2014. And today, he is the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Bildt, welcome. Many people, almost 1 million people around the world follow you on social media. You're quite...
750,000.
Three-quarters of a million. I think you're very well known as an outspoken figure on social media, which is increasingly becoming a driving force in politics. So why don't you tell us a little bit about why are you so active on social media?
Well, I mean, I started by using social media primarily to get information myself, to follow what others were saying and gathering information and being able to follow developments around the world and from sources of news and sources of opinion that were somewhat outside what I read in the normal newspapers. So that's how it started. And then I started to try to, tell what I was doing, primarily when I was foreign minister, because then it might have been somewhat more interesting than it is today. And then to give my views and opinions. But I try to be sort of moderate in what I write. I can be ironic, I can be critical, but always try to be respectful, primarily respectful of facts and situations and things like that. So the polarization that you see on social media, I distinctly try to avoid.
So because of that polarization, I think there's an increasing consensus around the world that social media is becoming a more harmful force than a force for good in international politics. Do you think that's right?
I'm not quite certain of that, but I mean, clearly you have those tendencies. There are sort of harmful elements of it that is given a voice to, voice to opinions that were already there. It's not that it invented these things. I mean, it reflects opinions and tendencies that are there in our societies, but it gives them a platform, no question about that. But there's also a good side of it in the sense that other information is available. People all over the world, young people, interested people, engaged people, open-minded people, they get access to information in a way that was virtually impossible before. So there are the minuses, no question about that. But we should also be respectful of the plus sides that are there.
So let's talk a little bit about the overall political discourse we're seeing in the West today, because I think for many of us sitting here in the Middle East, you know, we look at what's happening in the United States, we look at the rise of far-right parties in Europe, for example, and we think, you know, on the one hand, a rise in populism is obviously reflective of the wishes of the population. On the other hand, the discourse seems to be getting increasingly unhealthy and more combative. Is that something that you see sitting in Europe as a former prime minister?
I see it, of course, primarily in the United States. We have the tendencies in Europe as well, but I mean, no comparison really. I'm rather worried by some of the tendencies I see in American society. I mean, if you look at opinion polls in the US, you have roughly 70% of people who've been saying consistently for some years that the country is moving in the wrong direction. If you put the same question to people in Europe, those figures are much lower. That being said, you have those that are dissatisfied. We've always had, if you go back sort of 50 years in time, you always had 20-25% of the electorate who are, sometimes they voted left communists. And now they're right populists who are dissatisfied with the one or the other aspect of it. It could be economic issues before. It's more now sort of cultural issues, migration. So it is worrying, absolutely. But there's a distinct difference between what we see in Europe and the intense polarization that you see in American society.
But you don't think there's a risk of contagion? I mean, for example, right, Elon Musk just a few days ago was speaking at the Alternative for Deutschland rally. There's clearly an influence of American politics and what's happening in America on the continent.
There is, absolutely. I mean, there's a risk of that. I'm still uncertain. I'm interested to see how it works out in Germany, whether the Elon Musk intervention does have a positive or negative effect, because there could also be a backlash against it. I mean, Americans coming in preaching to the German electorate is not necessarily something that is appreciated. Could be, remains to be seen. But there is distinctly a risk of not necessarily importing, but some of these, I mean, we had, after Trump first election victory. We had Steve Bannon coming to Europe, trying to set up political parties and organizing schools and things like that. That backfired. Now we have Elon Musk trying to do something along those same lines. Will that work? Remains to be seen. Worth watching, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I want to talk about Sweden more specifically while we're on this subject, because with the shift in politics in Europe on issues like you mentioned, migration.
Yeah.
I mean, Sweden is a country that for the past 15, 20 years has often been mentioned in this part of the world as a destination for refugees. It was a very open and accepting country. Now, in the Swedish government, there's talk of paying foreign-born Swedes to leave and to go back to their countries of origin. And the idea of remigration, I think it's called, is picking up steam across the continent. I mean, what do you think that Sweden has as much of an open future as we've known it for the past couple of decades?
I think it's still one of the most open societies in terms of the attitude of people. But there's also the sort of the view recognition, you might say, that it went somewhat too fast. And people are saying, well, let's pause and make certain that integration really works. So the problem hasn't really been immigration, but the numbers have led to integration not really working. Because integration takes time. And we didn't give it the attention that we should have been given. And that means that we have on the fringes of this, we have criminality and gangs and things like that. And that has led to a political reaction. And that is then leading to an adjustment of policy. No question about that. You see it in all European countries. It is still a reaction to very large extent 2015 and the big wave that came in then. And if we look at that particular wave, have we integrated them? Yeah, well, not enough. And that puts strain on our society to a certain extent.
But surely policy ideas such as, paying foreign-born citizens even, or their families to leave, it creates a kind of idea within the society at large that perhaps these people don't belong here, even if they get citizenship, even if their children go to Swedish
schools.
But to
say that, there are quite a number of people who want to go back. One of the problems that we're having at the moment, we have a very large number of, by European standards, a very large number of people coming from Syria. We've had that for a very long time. Sort of started with Christians and all sorts of denominations, but primarily the 2015. Now, with the change in Damascus, we have people who want to go back. We still have a recommendation from the Swedish government, you can't go back because it's a dangerous place. So they are violating Swedish rules by going back. If they want to go back, some of them, I don't expect that to be the majority of them, but I do expect, and I know that numbers would like to go back. I think it is fair enough that we give them some help.
But you don't see that as being at odds with the idea of integrating these people and making them feel Swedish rather than encouraging them?
Well, it depends on what they want to do. If they come to Sweden as refugees because there's an intolerable situation in their own country, and perhaps if we take the Syrian example, they didn't expect Assad to fall. Accordingly, they were trying to integrate insofar as they wanted. But a lot of them were still long for home. And if home suddenly becomes available, then some of them would say, that's where we're coming from. We want to go back and try to rebuild our country. Then we should help with that. But the key thing is, of course, it's a voluntary arrangement. It's if they want to. If they don't want, they have been given permission in our country, and that's it. And then integration is the name of the game.
I want to shift focus just a little bit. So one of the things you're doing here in Abu Dhabi is speaking about artificial intelligence. You were prime minister in the pre-AI age, the pre-social media age, really.
Yeah.
But now AI seems to be changing everything everywhere, and governments are embracing it increasingly as part of the national infrastructure. Do you think that's a smart move?
I think it's a necessary move because it clearly is sort of a technology that is going to change virtually everything. I was prime minister in the beginning of the internet age, and it was fairly obvious that that was going to change everything, which it eventually did. But of course, then email was the big thing, and it was a long time ago. And then came the web, and then came everything else, and now we are AI. We were in the industrial age, and we are now in the beginning of the digital age. And now it's AI, it will be quantum computing, it will be a number of other things that is probably beyond what we can even imagine. So we must look at how to use it for the benefit of society. We must also be aware of the problems that might be there and see if we can find global frameworks that leads to the most positive development that is possible, and then avoid the dangers, because dangers might be there as well.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me personally, like sometimes anyway, perhaps in my worst nightmares, there's an inevitable slide towards AI playing a greater and greater role in not just as a tool for government, but as a fundamental part of governance. And let me ask you, I mean, if you were Prime Minister today, or perhaps, in the near future, how sophisticated do you think an artificial intelligence would need to be in order to be, let's say, deciding public services or playing a part in the administration of a country's resources?
Not in taking decisions, but in helping to execute decisions. I would find it fairly useful. Clearly, it can take over already today or tomorrow. It can take over quite a number of routine tasks of different sorts. That's fine. That means that sort of persons who are doing those routine things can do more productive things, hopefully. It might be, but we are early days, that it can lead to sort of education being more sort of geared to the needs of the individual. That could be something that's extremely good. There's no question that it will advance the possibilities in medicine, identifying sicknesses, identifying how you can help individuals geared to their own particular problems. So there are quite a number of areas. I think we're only in the beginning of this particular development. But at the same time, I think if I were Prime Minister, I would give a lot of emphasis to educating people about AI, making them aware of what it is, the possibilities certainly, but also the limitations, and how to use it, so that we have an AI-aware society. And that makes it, I think, better, or increases the possibility of sort of controlling it and managing in a way that is beneficial for society.
So I just want to follow up by picking up on something you said early on in your answer. So you would, as a tool, but not as a decision maker. I mean, here in the Middle East, one of the more, I think, shocking revelations we had since the start of the war in Gaza were allegations that the Israeli military was using AI as a tool for targeting in Gaza. And not as a decision maker, allegedly. But, if the reports are true, then there's a kind of sliding scale between the human decision making, the delegation to AI, who's really in control of the ethics, and the two sort of blend together. I mean, do you not think that such a powerful tool in the hands of flawed decision makers can lead to disastrous consequences?
It can. But accordingly, we have sort of very sort of lively discussion about that. One of the most interesting, wasn't that much reported, but there was a statement coming out of the United States and China a couple of months ago, where they, after extensive discussions between sort of the senior commanders on both sides, they decided that AI should have no role in any decision making when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons. That's, of course, highly important. There has been a lot of international discussion on autonomous weapon systems. And in a number of countries, there are rules that says that when it comes to sort of killing things and that sort of lethal use of force, there must be a human in the chain of taking decisions. Now, there are borderline cases, absolutely. We have certain, the Americans have, not quite, I don't think we have, but possible, that you have sort of air defense systems that if you have a very fast incoming missile, you don't really have the time to react. And then the weapon system sort of sees it and destroys it. But then it's weapon against weapon. I agree with you that sort of this could become a sliding scale at some point in time. But there is a discussion. There are rules in the U.S. Armed Forces, I know, in the European Armed Forces, I know, but there might be others who are somewhat less careful, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of rules in the armed forces is
Well, yeah, I can see your skeptical look at it, but it's important. It's important. You have, I mean, even in the armed forces, you have lawyers. The Israelis say they have it. I would say it's not that obvious, but even they say that they adhere to the rules of war.
So since we're talking about bending rules, I mean, one of the discussions you and I were having before this interview was about the kind of rules-based order and how the election of Donald Trump has kind of cast a shadow over that. So tell me, what does it look like right now as, you know, a former world leader sitting in Scandinavia, looking at Donald Trump trying to acquire Greenland, trying to put pressure on countries to increase their defense spending, to try and kind of, you know, change the game of the international order. Do you think that this is the start of an inevitable trend towards a different kind of international order?
It's clearly what I consider a worrying trend. Whether it started, I don't think it started with Trump, but I mean, we have both take two leaders, Mr. Putin, Mr. Trump. They talk in terms of we are a sovereign nation. That sounds good, but what they mean is we are not bound by any rules. And if you take the phrase that was often used, the rules-based global order, they don't respect rules. I mean, what Trump is saying is, I make the rules, and I make it out of what is in America's interest. I don't really care about the rest of the world. That is, of course, something that you can possibly, I don't think long-term you can, but possibly you can say it if you are the preeminent power, if you believe that you are the preeminent power of the world. I think long-term it's going to work to the detriment of the United States as well. But then if you talk to somewhat smaller countries, I mean Sweden and the Emirates could be taken as two examples, we are dependent upon the rules of the game. If this is a word where the might is right, smaller countries are in for trouble. Long term, I think bigger countries as well, but whether they recognize that sufficiently, that's another question. But so it is a worrying development, no question about that. That we see coming out of the United States at the moment. Trump, we saw with Putin violating the territorial integrity and invading another country. Others could well follow. I've dealt quite a lot with the Balkans and wars there. They're very happy changing borders by force there, but that should not be allowed either.
I mean, I don't want to reach too far back into history, but I think a lot of critics would suggest that even the rules-based order that you're speaking about, which might be on the wane, was created by those with might. It was very much a might is right world. I mean, this is why we have 5 permanent members on the Security Council.
But absolutely it was. And it's never been a perfect thing, but it was based on the experience of what happened when we didn't have any rules. Global wars. And then you tried to create the rules that were supposed to prevent that. It did. Broadly speaking, it did. And the rules that created the possibility of economic expansion throughout the world, and basically did. Was it perfect? No. Was it respected by everyone all the time? No. But it was an attempt, and if you look back on the last 50, 60 or 70 years, it's probably the best in human history so far. And that's not too bad.
If you were Prime Minister today, would you support Sweden joining NATO?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was in favor of that for a long time, but
So do you think, I suppose, how would you suggest that, I'm trying to think how to put this. I mean, I'll put it very bluntly. How would you suggest that world leaders today pursue an end to the war in Ukraine? What's the resolution?
the resolution is, of course, that the Russians would have to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine.
And if they refuse?
And if they refuse, we'll have to sort of try to persist in getting them to do that step by step. I mean, we have different instruments trying to do that. I mean, sanctions is one. It is never going to be enough. but clearly it is sort of degrading the Russian economy over time. Supporting and helping Ukraine is another one. Global diplomacy is a third one. Talking to those that are, if not supporting, at least tolerating the Russians. Because if we accept that you can grab another country or grab the parts of another country, that's unacceptable. I mean, we've seen it before. Remember Saddam Hussein, who suddenly said Kuwait doesn't have any right to exist. And he sent in his army. And at that particular time, the Security Council said, no, 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 no. And significant armed forces were sent there and did throw out Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, which was the right thing to do. Russia is a somewhat bigger place. Nuclear weapons so can't really be done to the same extent, but the principles are the same.
And would you say the same thing about Israel and Palestine?
Yes.
So the only way forward is to just keep trying.
Well, I mean, obviously to me, I mean, the only solution that is there is a two-state solution. And what we've said from the European Union side, I know that because I was chairman of the Council of Ministers when we took this decision, is that it should be based on 1967 borders. If the Israelis and the Palestinians agree to adjust those particular borders and switch territories and whatever, that's up to them. That's perfectly possible. But the basis should be international law and should be the 67 borders.
It seems to me that, and this is the last subject I think we'll tackle, but it seems to me that today the two-state solution is more or less moribund in Israeli politics. I mean, I can't think of a single Israeli politician who will talk about it out loud. And
I know some, but I'm not quite certain they say it loud. I agree with you at the moment.
Correct,
no,
yeah.
yeah.
And so I suppose, where does that leave us? I mean, Israel has many allies in Europe. Do you think that situation is tenable?
No, I don't think it's tenable. And I think you can understand the trauma. October 7th created trauma, no question about that, in Israeli society first, and then we have a trauma in the Arab world of what happened in Gaza. So there's we are dealing with traumas all over this particular region at the moment. At some point in time, that has to be overcome. And people have to start to think long term.
Well, Carl Bildt, thank you so much.
Thank you. A pleasure.